They say photographs trap a sliver of time that never learns how to die. In a factory town called Marrow's Field, a single glass print from 1897 still breathes. It shows 13 seamstresses posed in a narrow studio, hems of dark skirts kissing the floor. 12 faces can be named by descendants and payroll ledgers. One cannot. In the far right corner stands a figure in a hooded hat with a single red glove. The dye burns against grey paper like a coal under ash. The photographer wrote on the back with an iron nib. She didn't speak, just stood there. One shot only. That is the entire record. The women swore no such person worked beside them. The ledgers agree. Yet the negative bears her outline, crisp as needlework. In the 2 years after the sitting, several women from the picture vanished from streets that should have been safe. This is not folklore told by candlelight. This is a photograph that survives, and a ledger of names that ends too soon. The photograph was taken in New York City, 1897, at the edge of the Lower East Side, where the hum of sewing machines mingled with the rattle of horse carts. The neighborhood was swollen with recent arrivals. Italian widows, Jewish daughters from Poland, Irish girls escaping famine's shadow. They rented cramped flats and tenements that leaned on each other like exhausted bodies. The air smelled of coal smoke, starch, and wool dust. In these narrow streets, photography was both luxury and proof of belonging, proof that one's labouring family existed in this new country. The seamstresses gathered that spring afternoon were not society ladies. They were needleworkers, paid by the piece, stitching shirtwaists until their fingertips hardened into callus. Most earned barely enough to pay for bread and lamp oil. They lived 3, 4, sometimes 6 women to a room. Many of them sent coin back across the Atlantic, trying to feed parents they would never see again. The studio photograph was an indulgence, perhaps arranged by a forewoman with ambition. A portrait was meant to say, "We were here, we stood together, we mattered." The New York of 1897 was a city of contradictions. On Broadway, electric lights had begun to shimmer, promising a modern century, but just a few blocks south, the factory fires burned into the night. Accidents were common. Laws protecting workers were thin. For women, especially unmarried immigrants, the workshop was both a livelihood and a trap. Long hours bent their spines and strained their eyes. Pay docked without warning, yet there was camaraderie. Laughter over shared bread, whispers about dreams of marriage or a chance to study English. Life was hard, but not without flickers of warmth. Inside the photograph, those 12 identifiable women radiate that mixture weariness tempered by resolve. You can read it in their eyes. Some hold thimbles, others cross arms over aprons. The photographer positioned them carefully, knowing the group portrait would be hung in a workshop office or sent to families overseas. The background is plain, a painted cloth with faint floral swirls. The light falls flat. Standard for the era, nothing is unusual except the 13th figure at the far edge. She wears no apron, no thimble. Her coat is heavy, too formal for a humid workshop. The wide-brimmed hat veils much of her face. Only her right hand shows, gloved in red. The dye would not have been common among working women. Red kid leather gloves were expensive and, more importantly, carried specific connotations. In that decade, they were used in funeral processions for dignitaries, an accessory reserved for those who guided caskets or signaled mourning in high ceremony. To see such a glove in a seamstress portrait is a jolt, like hearing a funeral march played at a wedding. Those who later examined the photograph noted how no shadow fell beneath her figure. Her outline is sharp, but her placement feels half a step removed. In group portraits, strangers are always absorbed by the symmetry, but here, the stranger stands apart, a fissure in the pattern. Even without knowing the later tragedies, the viewer senses intrusion. She does not belong, yet she insists on being seen. The city around them had its share of legends. Immigrant quarters birthed ghost stories. Women who wandered in tattered shawls, wailing in languages forgotten by their children. Portents carried in scraps of clothing found on riverbanks. It was an era when superstition and progress clashed daily. The seamstresses themselves, however, likely thought little of it that day. To them, the studio sitting was a chance to send proof of their endurance back home, a moment to say, I survived the voyage, I am working, I stand with friends. None could have guessed that within 2 years, their fates would be tied to the woman who never spoke. Even the photographer was unsettled. On the reverse of the cabinet card, written in his cramped hand, survives the note. She didn't speak, just stood there, one shot only, no name, no explanation, only testimony that he noticed her silence. Professional photographers in the city often handled dozens of sittings a week, yet he felt compelled to remark on this one. That alone suggests something out of place, a detail that disturbed him enough to commit ink to cardboard. As the photograph circulated quietly among families, no one questioned at first. Life demanded too much attention, rent, hunger, the ever-present risk of illness. But with hindsight, the group image became uncanny. Descendants tracing genealogy discovered 12 names, each matched to payroll slips, baptismal records, or ship manifests. The 13th remained void. No wage slips, no census entry, no death certificate. She stands at the corner of the image, defying archival logic. In a city obsessed with documenting its swelling population, she left no trace but this single glove of red. The photograph might have remained an oddity if not for the stories that began to surface in the months following its creation. Within a year of the studio sitting, rumors crept through the tenements like smoke through cracks. The first loss was subtle, barely marked in newspapers. A young woman named Brigid Callahan, seated in the second row of the portrait, did not return home one summer night. She had worked a double shift at the factory, her body exhausted, her wages clutched tight. Her roommates expected her footsteps on the stairwell, but dawn broke without them. Police dismissed it as elopement. Girls run off, they said, but Brigid's trunk remained packed and her savings untouched. Her place in the photograph became the first void. Weeks later, another seamstress in the picture, Anna Weiss, daughter of Austrian immigrants, was found drowned in the East River, her face nearly unrecognizable. The police listed it as suicide. Yet, her friends insisted she had been cheerful the day before, planning to visit her married sister. The waterlogged body was buried quickly, without inquiry. A year after the photograph was taken, 2 names from its lineup were gone. To families, it seemed cruel coincidence. But to those who stared too long at the print, it felt like the glove in the corner had reached out. Descendants later reported something stranger. Several of the original cabinet cards, kept in trunks or frames, showed signs of fading. Not all at once, only particular figures seemed to blur. One woman swore her grandmother's copy had the corner where the red glove was located grow darker over time, as though a stain bled through the paper. Another collector noticed that while the rest of the image dulled with age, the glove itself retained an unnatural vividness, still smouldering crimson when other dyes had long surrendered to sepia. Photochemical experts argued about whether special pigments could explain the persistence. No one could account for the selectivity of the fading. The glove itself became a focal point of inquiry. Funeral historians who examined surviving accounts noted that in the 1,890 seconds, crimson or scarlet gloves were not a fashionable accessory for ordinary women. Instead, they appeared in highly ritualized contexts, Catholic requiems for prominent figures, Masonic funeral rites, and among certain societies of undertakers who used them to designate pall guides. The glove, then, symbolized the one who directs the dead to their place of rest. The presence of such a garment in a portrait of working women felt jarring, as though a priest had intruded into a tavern. Skeptics argued it was nothing more than eccentric attire. Yet the lack of matching records, no seamstress known to own such gloves, made the puzzle thicken. The photographer's note on the reverse rediscovered when his descendants sold a cache of prints in the 1930 seconds, only added to the unease. She didn't speak, just stood there, one shot only. That line, terse and clinical, conveys unease beneath its surface. Why specify her silence, unless it had unsettled him? Portrait photographers of the time often coaxed smiles or arranged poses, repeating shots when subjects shifted. To capture only one exposure, without repositioning, suggests haste or disturbance. Perhaps he feared insulting the stranger, or perhaps he sensed something he could not name. Scholars searching newspapers of the era noticed a cluster of unexplained absences tied to the same garment workshop. Beyond Callahan and Weiss, 3 other women from the photograph were reported missing in less than 2 years. One was last seen crossing the Bowery at dusk. Another vanished on her way to a church meeting. The last, Rosa DeSantis, was rumored to have boarded a ferry and never disembarked. Police records are fragmentary, but oral histories from relatives describe a haunting pattern. Women marked in that single image slipped away from the city's memory. Out of the original 12 identified seamstresses, nearly half met premature ends or disappeared. Only a handful lived into the next decade, their fates scattered, their descendants puzzled by the eerie attrition. The survivors spoke, briefly, in letters that survive by chance. One woman, writing to her cousin in Connecticut, mentioned the portrait. We had it taken with all of us. There was one woman in it none of us knew. I thought it a joke, but since then, I do not laugh. That letter was dated 1899, after 2 of her companions had vanished. It is one of the only first-person testimonies linking the unexplained figure to real unease among the women themselves. They had seen the stranger, but they could not agree whether she was flesh or phantom. By the 1920 seconds, the photograph surfaced in the possession of a collector of mystery prints. He presented it at a small society meeting in Manhattan devoted to psychical research. Members studied it under lamplight, remarking on the peculiar sharpness of the 13th figure compared with the others. The consensus, recorded in minutes of the meeting, was that the figure bore hallmarks of a double exposure, but none could explain how a double exposure would result in a subject that no one recalled entering or leaving. Double exposures usually blur. This one was too crisp, too intentional. A skeptic suggested the photographer had staged an actress, yet no actress came forward, and the note on the back undermined the idea of control. If it were a stunt, why write with such brevity, such unease? Later analyses in the mid-20th century attempted to test the print with chemical spectrography. Researchers found no evidence of tampering, no layering, inconsistent with standard 1890 seconds processes. The glove's pigment, however, defied expectations. It reflected light as though composed of a different medium, almost metallic in its persistence. Photochemists shrugged, citing anomalies in dye batches. But in folklore circles, whispers spread. The red glove was not mere fabric, but an imprint of something less material, a marker between life and death. Meanwhile, descendants of the seamstresses carried private fears. Oral testimonies collected in the 1970 seconds from grandchildren describe households where the photograph was hidden, sometimes even burned. One woman recalled her grandmother ordering the image thrown into the fireplace, muttering, "She looks at us still." Another remembered that the portrait was never displayed on the wall, only kept in a box, face down. Families remembered the disappearances, and the print was treated less as memento and more as contagion. The glove became the subject of symbolic readings. To some, it represented the silent class struggle of women, whose labor was unseen, red as the blood in their fingers from endless stitching. To others, it symbolized death's inevitability, stitched into the fabric of industrial life, where factory fires and disease cut youth short. Yet the literal presence, the figure who had no name, no ledger, resisted metaphor. She remained a fact of silver nitrate and paper, standing in the corner like a mute witness to tragedies yet to unfold. Modern scholars looking back draw chilling timelines. Of the 13 present, only 7 have genealogical records stretching beyond 1900. 4 disappear entirely. 2 die confirmed deaths in accidents. The photographer himself, known from city directories as Samuel Hirsch, vanishes from listings by 1899. His studio closed abruptly, his negatives auctioned, no death certificate has been located. His absence folds into the litany of vanishings connected to that single spring day. What began as a portrait of endurance became an accidental obituary. The deeper one follows the paper trail, the more the photograph ceases to look like chance. By 1899, city directories listed the garment workshop shuttered, its owner bankrupt, survivors scattered to other employers. And yet, in oral histories collected decades later, those who lived longest described a shadow that lingered after the studio sitting. One survivor, Lena Brodsky, spoke in 1931 to a journalist compiling immigrant memories. Her testimony, buried in the archives of a small Yiddish newspaper, was rediscovered by accident in the 1980 seconds. She recalled the day of the portrait. We were 12. She made 13. None of us saw her enter. None of us saw her leave. She stood there, and the photographer did not argue. He looked pale. After we joked a little, but inside I was frightened. When Bridget disappeared, I thought of her glove. When Anna drowned, I thought again. And when Rosa was gone, I stopped thinking. I did not wish to call her by thought anymore. Lena lived until 1947. She never allowed the photograph in her house. The fear endured half a century, as if the glove could reach across time. Investigators in the 20th century tried to rationalize the pattern. Perhaps the stranger was an unrelated mourner who stumbled into the studio by mistake. Perhaps she was a forewoman, forgotten in ledgers. But every record denies her existence. Payrolls list 12. Housing registers list 12. Even the photographer's appointment book, one of the few surviving scraps from his studio, notes seamstress group 12 sitters, 12 not 13, and yet the plate itself holds 13. Theories grew darker. Some researchers noticed parallels between the photograph and European folklore of the red-handed guide, a spectral woman who appears at crossroads, pointing silently toward misfortune. In certain Slavic traditions, she is said to attend those marked for early death, always visible in the corner of the eye. The glove, crimson as coals, serves as her mark. Could immigrant communities have carried whispers of such figures across the Atlantic? If so, the glove wearer may have been less invention than apparition, a folkloric presence embedded in immigrant consciousness. Skeptics counter. Perhaps the women themselves, under strain and exhaustion, retroactively projected meaning into an ordinary mistake. Memory warps, fear invents. But the material fact remains. A stranger's body is etched into collodion, sharper than any blur, accompanied by a note from the photographer himself that confirms her silence. The climax of the story emerges not in theories but in the piling evidence of human absence. Between 1897 and 1899, nearly half of those who smiled or frowned for the camera were erased from New York's streets. The stranger's red glove begins to feel less like a garment and more like a ledger mark. The photograph becomes a prophecy, its corner occupied by the one who tallies names before the ink of history dries. Later caretakers of the image noted other peculiarities. Under magnification, the red glove appears to have no visible stitching. While other garments show the weave of fabric, the glove's surface is unnaturally smooth, as though painted onto the plate itself. Attempts to analyze its chemistry found traces inconsistent with 1890 seconds dyes more metallic than organic. A forensics expert in the 1970 seconds described it as a pigment that reflects like dried blood but does not degrade. The unsettling description deepened the photograph's legend. By the 1980 seconds, when the photograph entered the collection of a New York Historical Society, curators debated whether to display it. One argued it was a rare sociological artifact of immigrant women. Another warned that the law surrounding it would overshadow any scholarly value. When it was finally exhibited, visitors reported feeling watched. Security logs mentioned 2 incidents of fainting near the case, one by a young woman who claimed the glove moved, Rational explanations, bad lighting, stress abound, yet the incident records exist. The climax is not a single revelation, but an accumulation of weight. Disappearances, testimonies, forensic oddities, and cultural echoes converging around a single corner of a single print. The story resolves into a shape too heavy to dismiss. The woman in the red glove becomes not an error of exposure, but the thread connecting tragedy, folklore, and silence. To view the photograph today is to confront more than a group of seamstresses. It is to face an empty seat at the table of history, a 13th presence that defies census and ledger, but endures in silver nitrate. One cannot name her. One cannot erase her. She is both witness and omen, and her silence has outlived every seamstress who once laughed in the dim light of the Lower East Side. The photograph today survives behind glass, housed in a climate-controlled drawer of the New York Historical Society. Few visitors are permitted to handle it. Most encounter it only through reproductions in books on anomalous photography, yet even copies seem to carry unease. Archivists whisper that interns refuse to catalogue the file too long, claiming the glove catches their eye and refuses to release it. The enduring question is not whether the image exists. It does, chemical and tangible, but what it represents. Skeptics insist on mundane explanations. A stranger intruding on the session, later forgotten. An undocumented worker not noted in payroll ledgers, an artifact of photographic error. Yet each hypothesis collides with stubborn facts. No one recalls her entry. No ledger records her wage. And photographic errors do not produce figures sharper than their surroundings, nor write notes on the back confirming a subject's eerie silence. Historians of labor view the portrait differently. For them, the 13th figure embodies all the women lost to industry before their names reached record books. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was still 14 years away, but the dangers already pressed in: locked exits, dim gaslight, and endless fatigue. To see a red-gloved stranger in the photograph is to glimpse the shadow of mortality hanging over every young woman who stitched her youth into factory seams. Perhaps she was not a ghost, but a symbol unconsciously conjured by the camera itself, reflecting a truth the city refused to acknowledge, that death stood in the workshop like a silent overseer. Folklorists, on the other hand, frame her as a cultural echo. Immigrant communities carried centuries of superstition. In Slavic tales, the red-handed guide marked those who would not live long. In Mediterranean lore, crimson gloves belonged to mourners who prepared the newly departed. When dozens of cultures pressed into a single neighborhood, perhaps myths condensed into image. The camera, an invention already mysterious to many, might have been seen as capable of summoning more than likeness. For believers, the glove was not coincidence, but confirmation. What lingers is less the photograph itself than its consequences. Out of 13 figures, nearly half were erased by disappearance or premature death within 2 years. Families remembered. Stories passed through kitchens and attics, each retelling sharpening the dread. By the time descendants shared their memories with researchers in the 20th century, the portrait was already legend, a picture cursed by the presence of a woman who did not belong. In reflection, the photograph teaches us something about how we confront history. We yearn for clarity in records, neat ledgers, official explanations. Yet the past is riddled with gaps, people who vanish between census years, lives unmarked by certificates. The red-gloved woman embodies that void. She is the absence that resists closure, the silence at the edge of documentation. Whether phantom or flesh, she reminds us that history is never complete. Standing before her image, one senses a reversal. Instead of us studying her, it feels as if she studies us. The tilt of her veiled head, the hidden face, the single hand extended, these suggest judgment more than pose. Perhaps that is why the photograph unsettles across centuries. It refuses to stay artifact. It acts. It intrudes into the present, asking each viewer a question they cannot answer. What does it mean to be remembered, and what does it mean to be erased? The resolution is not comfort, but confrontation. We may never learn her name, never discover where she came from, or why she stood among seamstresses she did not know. What remains is the lesson that images are not passive. They shape memory, bend interpretation, and sometimes, like this one, haunt the living. To this day, the file is marked simply Seamstress Group 1897. 13 figures. The archivists know better. There were 12 names, and one silent witness. If this story unsettled you, subscribe for more forgotten horrors of history, where photographs, relics, and whispers refuse to stay buried in the past.